North Texas Republican Congressman Pat Fallon, thank you so much for joining us. As you know, the House is going to be voting on an article of impeachment against President Trump today. How are you going to vote and why?
Well, thanks, Jack, for having me. I appreciate it. I'll be voting no on impeachment for several reasons, one of which, and the most less talked about, is the fact that we're talking about the impeachment of the President of the United States, removing him from office involuntarily. And it didn't even go through the committee process. The Judiciary Committee has not heard this in full. If you can recall from the 70s and the Nixon hearings and how laborious they were, but they really did their jobs and they uncovered things that they otherwise, when they started the inquiry, they didn't even have knowledge of. That's the way to do it. So fundamentally, just from a procedural standpoint, I would be opposed to anything of this severity and weight without going through the committee process. And secondly, the Democrats are saying that the president is an imminent threat to democracy, and yet the riots happened on Wednesday. For the last week, it's been peaceful and nothing has occurred, and they can't point to anything according to them, anything that he's done since that has been anything remotely other than, just a regular business as usual. So, and then finally, and most importantly, the mob committed the violence on Wednesday. I mean, I was literally on the front lines of it, and the president did not. I read the context, I read the text of his speech, and somebody once said to me, truth in context. And so I looked at that, and even in their articles of impeachment, they don't say his words. They say his words if you take them in context. In other words, their reading of them. And when I read, and to be specific here, when I read that he said, we're going to walk down and I'll be there. We're going to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women, and we'll be marching over the Capitol building to be peacefully and patriotically heard. So I just don't see remotely how this rises to the level, because the mob committed violence. The mob destroyed property. The mob violated the sanctity of the Capitol and the legislative process. President Trump did not.
As you know, Democrats disagree, but even some Republican members of Congress strongly disagree. They believe that what he said did lead to the violence and that it is an impeachable offense. So what do you say to your Republican colleagues, including Liz Cheney, who's very conservative, number 3 in leadership, about that?
Well, first of all, that's, again, another fair point. I believe at the end of the day, and we'll find out in a few hours, that of the 212 seated Republicans in the chamber, there will be, it's hard to say exactly, but I wouldn't be surprised if it ended up being single digits. So even if it's 12 or 13, it's a small minority, 5%. So about 95% of our Republican colleagues will be voting the way I have. And it's a dangerous and slippery slope, too. When you don't like what the president says and then a mob goes haywire, does that mean that in a year if President Biden gives a speech and the mob takes to the streets and commits violence, that we're going to impeach him too? Because that's the standard that they're holding to now. And that's unfortunate. There was a lot of violence in the United States last summer, and there was a lot of incendiary comments made by our Democratic colleagues, and they were very unfortunate. I've always condemned political violence. I abhor it. We have a First Amendment right, and I want people to vent and exercise that right peacefully. So I condemn the protests, the BLM and the Antifa protests that weren't just for an afternoon or a day or a week, but months in a lot of cases. And I'm condemning what happened on January 6th as well, to the people that committed the violence. I don't remember anybody complaining about Democratic rhetoric in 2017 when a leftist Democrat shot up the Republicans as they were practicing baseball, simply because the only person that's responsible for that man's actions he is responsible for his actions. I wouldn't say that Maxine Waters was, even though she said some awful things about surrounding Republicans and getting in their face and giving them no peace. So I think we should all be more responsible with our words, and I just didn't see anything the president said that would remotely lead me to say we need to remove the man when he has less than 160 hours in office.
And what do you say, because they've also said that there needs to be some kind of deterrence for a future president to know what, the boundaries are for speech?
Oh, I think that's incredibly dangerous and un-American, and I believe that even some folks in the ACLU would agree with that as well. Freedom of speech is at the core of the Democrats keep saying, Jack, that it's our democracy. it is a representative republic, and it is a representative republic for a reason. Democracies are more fragile. It is a cornerstone of our representative republic that we have freedom of speech, that we have dissent, we have peaceful dissent. And I just did an interview, my first one out in front of the Capitol building, and when a reporter asked me, "So do you don't think the president should be removed for this dangerous speech?" And I said, "But he didn't tell anybody. If he had said, 'I want you to go and commit unlawful acts. I want you to show them what you're made of. And if you have to, get vicious with them.' Okay, yeah, then we can have a very different conversation. But that just didn't occur, and it hasn't since."
And the president did use, words like you have to fight for your country in a strong way, not in a weak way.
Mm-hmm.
What's your thought on that?
I think that's a metaphor that, yeah, I always agree that you have to fight. And even you have to always passionately fight for what you believe in, both Democrats and Republicans. And I tip my cap to people that don't agree with me that fight for what they believe in. I've made a euphemism for the last 8 months, or I shouldn't say 8 months, about 5 or 6 months. But when I was running for this office, I would tell people in East Texas, you know what? You hired the right person because you just hired a knife fighter. And I meant that metaphorically, because I didn't mean that I'm actually going to wield a knife in the House chamber or brandish it in front of somebody. I mean that I'll be scrappy but polite. I want to fight fiercely, but I want to do it with decorum. And there's a way in which we go about doing things. So yeah, people are now starting to read into adjectives like that, meaning, oh, you better not have to say fight. I couldn't disagree with any kind of movement like that. We're adults. We understand that when maybe you joke around, or remember when you had a brother or sister, you said, "I'm gonna kill you." I don't really mean that way. Now the president didn't use any language like that, but when we're talking to friends, there's different context. When we're talking to groups, there's different context. When we're talking politically, fighting does not mean invading the Capitol and smashing things up and murdering a police officer with a fire extinguisher across the head. It doesn't mean it when Democrats say it. It doesn't mean it when we say it.
You were there, obviously. Talk to me a little bit about, you said you broke off some furniture to stand your ground.
Oh, it was harrowing and horrifying. We were debating the finer points of the Constitution and the Electoral College, and then a bunch of moron, idiot mob. And you know how the mob mentality is. They get these bullies and these cowards get more emboldened as the more brazen they become, and the more their numbers grow. And they secured the chamber, and then they told us that they wanted us. There were some safety protocols they wanted us to adhere to. And then when the mob reached Statuary Hall, they said we were going to evacuate. But then some parts of the mob reached the actual doors, those center doors where the president would walk in when you have a State of the Union address. And there weren't enough Capitol policemen there. It was evident. And Tony Gonzalez and Ronnie Jackson and Troy Nels, all Republican Texas freshmen, started to hold the line and augment the security force. And then I was about to leave, and I saw that, and I said, I'm not going to leave my brothers in arms there. So we broke off hand sanitizer stations. I have one. This is the one that I did. And it's got this is the business end of it now because it was jagged, and actually it still works. So we're not only fighting the mob, we were fighting COVID. And I didn't think that was going to happen, but here we are holding the House chamber from a mob of Americans. This hasn't happened, in 200 years since the British were here in 1814. It was obnoxious. It's sickening. It'll always sicken me. And these folks there were folks from my district trying to defend them and say to me, well, what do you expect them to do? I don't expect them to do that. In fact, that's the exact opposite thing that I expect them to do. They hired a fighter. And again, metaphorically, a street fighter. But that day, I was truly a street fighter. I mean, I got a club in my hands, and we're strategizing. We're taking our ties off because we don't get it choked out if we get in a fist fight. So maybe it wasn't just such a metaphor.
Let me just ask you a couple other questions, and I appreciate your time. Last night, you voted against urging Vice President Pence to invoke the 25th Amendment. The Vice President said he wouldn't do it. Your reaction to the Vice President's letter to Congress saying he's not doing that?
No, I applaud him because he was very definitive and very decisive in saying, I'm not going to do it. And then we debated anyway, and we waste American taxpayers' time. We are hired to take care of meat and potato issues. We've got COVID. We've got an economy that's on the ropes. We want it to roar back. There's a lot of pent-up demand. We want to talk about infrastructure and transportation and healthcare and jobs. And here we are debating what we already know is a failed we already knew was a failed gesture, that the 25th Amendment was not going to be invoked. Vice President Pence said so. And the Democrats, the repeated theme that we heard, Jack, last night was he's an imminent threat. President Trump's an imminent threat. But again, the ugly afternoon of January 6th was a week ago. Nothing has happened since. How can it be imminent after a whole week? There's been nothing else. It's not an imminent threat. It's just political grandstanding and political theater.
But isn't there, didn't the FBI put out a warning about, armed protests at each of the state capitals and in Washington, through the next week or so?
Well, I'm glad they're being proactive, and you have to take any threat seriously. But my prediction is, and we'll come to find out, I think it's going to be, and I'm praying that it'll be much to do about nothing. There's going to be criminal elements in the United States, in a country of 330 million people, regardless of who the president of the United States is. So removing President Trump would, in fact, maybe make it a little bit more dangerous. I don't know. I don't know how these whack jobs think. Because if you're willing to commit political violence in this country at this time, when you still have, at least for now, a First Amendment right, which we're fighting for, I've been hired to do that, then let us do our jobs.
My last question to you is just about unity in the Republican Party, because there is some division. Some people say that the president should be impeached and removed, but obviously you and most other Republicans say no. So Democrats, all are in agreement, but that's not the case with the Republican Party. How difficult do you think it will be, and what's your message about bringing people in the party together?
This too shall pass, is what I'm saying. There's 95% or more of the party is united. And I talked about unity last night in the first time that I addressed the chamber, but I meant it in the sense of all Americans. The Democrats have said a lot about, they've used that word a lot over the last week, my first week in Congress, about unity. And I said, it's more than just a word, and it has to be more than just a word. Unity isn't just, if you want to achieve it, you can't just talk about it. You have to take actions to foster it and to father it. And the worst way to go about doing it is, instead of having a little bit of a fire, you throw water on it. You don't throw gasoline on it. And the Democrats had a chance to have a grand gesture and say, okay, what happened on January 6th was awful. We all, as a chamber and body, condemn it. Now let's move forward and do the work of the people. And that's what we really need to focus on.
Congressman Pat Fallon, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate your time today.
Thanks, Jack. Take care.